The charcoal was the hardest thing to hide. Rosie pressed her thumb against the seam of her uniform's apron, feeling the faint, gritty residue of a 4B pencil that had spent the morning mapping out the vaulted ceilings of a dream. Her skin was a map of contradictions. The palms of her hands were calloused from the rough handles of heavy ceramic mugs, but her fingertips were stained with the dust of a visionary. She stood behind the counter of the Salty Anchor, the air thick with the scent of griddle grease and the sharp, metallic tang of the Atlantic gale rattling the window panes. It was 6:02 a.m. The diner was a cage made of linoleum and chrome, a place where time didn't move forward so much as it circled back on itself in a loop of refills. And check, please. A customer at table 2 grunted, sliding his empty cup toward the edge of the laminate. Rosie moved before he could speak. Her body was tuned to the frequency of the diner's needs, a survival mechanism honed over 3 years of scraping together tuition for a degree the world thought she had no business pursuing. "More coffee, Mr. Henderson?" she asked. Her voice was soft. A silken thread pulled through the coarse fabric of the morning rush. The man didn't look at her face. He looked at her hands. Rosie saw his eyes linger on the smudge of gray on her index finger, and she instinctively tucked it into the fold of her apron. "Keep it coming, Rosie. It's a long walk to the docks today," he muttered. She filled the cup, the steam rising to dampen the loose curls of chestnut hair that had escaped her clip. She felt his gaze, but it wasn't the gaze she was waiting for. That gaze always came exactly 4 minutes later. At 6:06 a.m., the bell above the door chimed. A thin, tinny sound that usually got lost in the roar of the ocean outside, but today, it felt like a chord struck on a piano. Alexander walked in. He didn't look like the other men in this town. While the locals wore heavy flannel and boots caked in salt, Alexander wore coats that looked like they were sculpted from midnight. He was tall, with shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of a silent empire, and eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea, gray, deep, and impossibly intelligent. He moved to the corner booth, table 4. It was the only table in the diner that offered a clear view of the town's most tragic landmark, the St. Jude's Library. The building sat on the cliffside, its Gothic spires crumbling like old teeth against the horizon. Rosie took a breath, smoothing her apron. This was the first beat of the waltz. She didn't grab a menu. She didn't need to. She picked up the white ceramic mug, the one with the small chip on the base that only she knew about, and filled it with black coffee, no cream, no sugar. She walked toward him, her footsteps light against the grit of the floor. As she approached, she saw him setting a leather-bound notebook on the table. He didn't open it yet. He waited. She set the coffee down. The steam curled between them, a temporary veil. "Good morning," she said. It was the same 2 words she gave everyone, but here in the quiet alcove of table 4 they felt heavier. Alexander looked up. His eyes didn't slide over her like the other customers. He looked at her the way an architect looks at a foundation, searching for the hidden strength, the structural integrity. He noticed the slight tremor in her hand as she set the saucer down. He noticed the way she looked at the library through the window behind him, a look of such profound longing that it felt like a secret revealed. "Thank you, Rosie," he said. His voice was a low resonance, the kind of sound that felt like it originated in the floorboards. He didn't say anything else, he never did. He picked up his pen, a heavy silver instrument that looked like it cost more than Rosie made in a month, and began to write. Rosie retreated to the counter, but her mind stayed at table 4. From this distance, she watched the rhythm of his hand. He wasn't just writing, he was sketching. She knew the movement of a hand that was drafting, the sharp, decisive lines, the way he would pause, his thumb rubbing the side of his jaw, before committing a stroke to the paper. She pulled a crumpled sheet from her pocket, a blueprint she had been working on during her 15-minute break at 4 a.m. It was a study of the library's central dome. She had spent weeks researching the original 1890 construction, discovering that the failure wasn't in the stone, but in the drainage of the upper parapets. She had a solution, a way to reinforce the arches without destroying the Gothic aesthetic. She looked from her messy, pencil-smudged sketch to the man in the corner. Who was he? For 3 years he had been a fixture of her mornings. He never stayed more than an hour. He never left a mess. He tipped exactly 20% every single time. But he looked at her differently lately. There was a shift in the silence. It was no longer the silence of two strangers, but the silence of two people who were reading the same book in separate rooms. The lunch rush began to bleed into the morning, the atmosphere turning frantic. Rosie was a blur of motion, balancing 3 plates on one arm, navigating the narrow aisles with a grace that felt out of place among the grease-slicked tables. She felt Alexander's eyes on her. Not on her face, but on her movement. He was watching the way she managed the weight, the way she calculated the trajectory of her path to avoid a collision with a swinging kitchen door. At 7 a.m., Alexander stood up. He left a folded $10 bill under the saucer. Rosie watched him walk out into the rain, his collar turned up against the wind. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss, the end of the only hour of her day that felt like it belonged to her. She walked over to table 4 to clear the mug. The porcelain was still warm. She reached for the bill, but as she moved the saucer, her heart skipped. Next to the $10 bill sat his pen. It was the silver one, the one she had watched him use for years. It felt heavy as she picked it up, the metal cool against her palm. This wasn't an accident. A man like Alexander didn't forget a tool like this. She looked toward the door, ready to run after him, but the rain was a solid wall of gray. He was gone. She looked down at the pen. On the side, engraved in tiny, elegant script, were the words, "Form follows function." Rosie's breath hitched. It was the mantra of every architect who ever lived. She looked at her own charcoal-stained fingers, then back at the door. He knew. He had seen the books hidden under the counter. He had seen the sketches on the napkins. She tucked the pen into the deep pocket of her apron right next to her heart. The weight of it felt like a promise. The rest of the morning was a blur of noise. The ocean outside grew more violent, the waves crashing against the pier with a sound like cannon fire. Rosie worked through the ache in her lower back, the familiar burn in her calves. She served eggs that were too runny and coffee that was too cold, all while the silver pen burned a hole in her pocket. She found herself gravitating toward the window during the few seconds she had to breathe. The St. Jude's Library looked more skeletal than ever in the storm. Rumors had been swirling through the diner for weeks, that a developer from the city had finally bought the land, that the wrecking ball was coming. Every time a customer mentioned it, Rosie felt a physical pain in her chest. That library was her cathedral. It was where she had spent her childhood, hiding from the world in the stacks of dusty volumes on Greek revivals and Italian Renaissance structures. It was the only thing in this town that felt grand. "They're tearing it down, you know," a voice rasped. Rosie turned. It was Elias, a retired fisherman who lived in the shanty town near the docks. He was nursing a cup of tea, his eyes fixed on the cliffside. "They can't," Rosie said, her voice tighter than she intended. "It's a historical landmark. It's the heart of the coast." "Money doesn't care about hearts, girl," Elias sighed. "Some big-shot firm from New York bought the whole lot. They want a luxury hotel, something with glass walls and zero soul. They start the survey next week." Rosie gripped the handle of the coffee pot so hard her knuckles turned white. The survey. That meant the structural engineers would be there soon. They would see the cracks in the foundation, the rot in the beams, and they would declare it a lost cause. They wouldn't look for the drainage solution she had found. They wouldn't see the way the light hit the rose window at 4 p.m., turning the dusty floor into a mosaic of gold. She reached into her pocket and touched the pen. She thought of Alexander, the way he looked at the building, the way he looked at her. If he was who she suspected, a man of means, a man of intellect, why was he just watching? Why was he letting the world crumble around them? The shift ended at 2 p.m. Rosie walked into the tiny locker room at the back of the diner, her legs trembling with fatigue. She stripped off her apron and hung it on the hook, but she didn't leave the pen. She slid it into the pocket of her worn denim jacket. She stepped out the back door into the biting cold. Instead of heading toward her cramped apartment, she turned toward the cliff. The wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes with salt. She climbed the winding path toward the library, her boots sinking into the mud. The building loomed over her, a dark silhouette against the churning sea. She reached the heavy oak doors and pulled. They were locked, as they had been for a year since the county had pulled the funding. But Rosie knew the secret of the basement window, the one with the rusted latch that didn't quite catch. She dropped down into the darkness of the archives. The smell hit her instantly, old paper, damp stone, and the scent of centuries-old cedar. It was the smell of home. She clicked on her small flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating rows of boxes labeled Blackwood Estate, historical records. She had been coming here for months, painstakingly documenting every inch of the building's anatomy. She moved to her makeshift desk, a flat shipping crate in the corner, and spread out her sketches. She pulled out Alexander's pen. Under the beam of the flashlight, the silver glowed. She began to draw, not just the dome this time, but the entire facade. She drew the library as it was, and then, with trembling lines, she drew it as it could be. She integrated the modern reinforcement into the classic stone. She designed a glass atrium that would protect the original structure from the sea salt while allowing the light to flood the interior. She lost track of time. The rain hammered against the high windows above, a rhythmic percussion to the scratching of the silver pen. In the silence of the library, Rosie wasn't a waitress. She wasn't a girl with a mountain of debt and a tired mother to support. She was an architect. She was a builder of worlds. A floorboard creaked above her. Rosie froze. The sound had come from the main hall. She clicked off her flashlight, the darkness swallowing her whole. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They weren't the heavy boots of a security guard. They were the soft, measured steps of someone who moved with purpose. She held her breath, pressing her back against the cold stone wall. The footsteps stopped directly above her. Then, a light appeared. Not a flashlight, but the warm, steady glow of a phone screen. Through the gaps in the floorboards, she saw a shadow. A man was standing in the center of the rotunda. He was looking up at the dome, the very dome Rosie had just been sketching. She didn't need to see his face to know who it was. The height, the stillness, the way the air seemed to settle around him. Alexander was in her sanctuary. He didn't move for a long time. He stood there, a silent sentinel in the ruins, watching the shadows play across the ceiling. Then, he did something that made Rosie's blood run cold. He reached out and touched one of the crumbling pillars. He didn't touch it with pity. He touched it with the possessive, calculated grip of an owner. He pulled a device from his pocket, a laser measurer. The red dot danced across the arches, a tiny, lethal spark in the dark. He was measuring the decay. He was calculating the cost of the end. Rosie wanted to scream. She wanted to run up those stairs and demand to know why he had given her the pen if he was only here to measure the grave of her dreams. But she stayed in the shadows, her fingers curled tightly around the silver pen in her pocket. The waltz wasn't over. It was just getting dangerous. If this story is captivating you, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps us bring you more stories like this. The silver pen stayed in Rosie's pocket for 3 days before she found the courage to speak. During those 3 days, the atmosphere in the town of Oak Haven shifted. It was no longer just a rumor, it was an infection. The name Blackwood Group began to appear everywhere, tacked onto legal notices on the library's oak doors, printed in bold, cold typeface in the local gazette, and whispered over plates of greasy hash browns. Rosie felt the weight of the pen every time she moved. It was a physical reminder of the man in the corner booth, a man who seemed to be the only person in town not talking about the demolition. On the 4th morning, the rain had slowed to a persistent, salt-heavy mist. Alexander arrived at 6:06 a.m. sharp. He looked tired. There were faint shadows under his eyes, and his movements lacked their usual surgical precision. He sat down, but he didn't open his notebook. He simply stared out the window at the library, his jaw set in a hard, grim line. Rosie approached with the mug. Her heart was a drum in her ears. As she set the coffee down, she reached into her apron and pulled out the silver pen. She laid it on the table next to the saucer, the metal clicking softly against the laminate. "You left this," she said. Her voice was steady, though her pulse was anything but. Alexander didn't look at the pen. He looked at her. "I know." The simplicity of the answer caught her off guard. She took a half step back, her fingers twisting the fabric of her apron. "It's an expensive tool, Alexander. A person doesn't just leave something like this unless they're looking for a reason to come back." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Not a smile of amusement, but of recognition. "Perhaps I was looking for a reason to see if you'd use it." Rosie felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. She thought of the sketches in the basement, the way the silver ink had flowed over the paper, capturing the arches of the library with a clarity her cheap pencils never could. "I'm a waitress," she said, the lie tasting like ash. "What use would I have for a professional drafting pen?" Alexander leaned forward. The space between them narrowed, and suddenly the noise of the diner, the clatter of plates, the shouting of the cook, faded into a dull hum. "I've seen the way you look at the St. Jude's Dome, Rosie. You don't look at it like a landmark. You look at it like a puzzle you've already solved. Most people see a ruin. You see a structural failure in the western parapet that's causing a lateral load imbalance." Rosie froze. The air in her lungs felt thin. He had spoken the language of her soul, the secret dialect she had spent years learning from textbooks in the dead of night. "How do you know that?" she whispered. "Because I've spent my life looking for people who see the why instead of just the what," he replied. He pushed the pen back toward her. "Keep it. It's wasted in my pocket. I spend too much time signing death warrants for buildings like that one. It should belong to someone who still wants to build them." He stood up then, leaving his coffee untouched. He walked out into the mist, leaving Rosie standing in the center of the diner with the silver pen and a terrifying realization. The man she was falling for was the man who was killing her dream. The following week was a blur of escalating tension. The Blackwood Group had officially filed for a controlled structural removal, a polite term for a wrecking ball. The town was divided. Some wanted the jobs the new hotel would bring. Others mourned the loss of their history. Rosie worked double shifts, her body aching, her mind focused on the upcoming town hall meeting. She spent her nights in the library archives, fueled by a desperate, frantic energy. She wasn't just sketching anymore. She was calculating. She was using the silver pen to write a 50-page technical defense of the building. She found the original 1890 contracts, the geological surveys of the cliffside, and the specific composition of the local limestone. Every morning, Alexander sat in the booth. They didn't speak of the library again, but the subtext was a living thing between them. He would bring her architectural journals, rare international editions, and leave them on the seat when he left. She would leave him sketches on napkins, not of buildings, but of the way the light hit the sea, a silent way of showing him what would be lost if the glass and steel hotel was built. The romantic tension was no longer a waltz. It was a bridge being built in the dark. One Tuesday night, the diner was hit by a power outage during a massive coastal storm. The lights flickered and died, leaving the salty anchor illuminated only by the rhythmic flash of the lighthouse on the point. Rosie was the only one on shift. She was lighting candles on the tables when the door opened. Alexander walked in, soaked to the bone. He didn't look like a billionaire mogul. He looked like a man seeking shelter. "We're closed, Alexander," Rosie said, her voice soft in the candlelight. "I know," he said, moving toward her, "but I saw the light, and I couldn't go back to the hotel." He sat at the counter, not his usual booth. Rosie poured him a cup of coffee from the thermal carafe, the steam rising in the golden glow of the candle. "Why are you doing it?" she asked. The question had been rotting inside her for weeks. "Why the library? You're an architect. You know that building is a masterpiece. You know it can be saved." Alexander looked down at his hands. "I'm not the only one at Blackwood, Rosie. I have a board. I have investors who see a library as a liability and a hotel as a profit margin. They don't care about the soul of a town. And you? Do you care? He looked up, and for the first time Rosie saw the vulnerability behind the gray eyes. He reached across the counter, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. I cared the moment I saw a girl in a diner uniform reading the 10 books on architecture while she was supposed to be on her lunch break. I cared when I realized that girl knew more about the integrity of that cliffside than my entire engineering team. Rosie's breath caught. Then stop them. It's not that simple. It is, she said, her voice rising with a sudden, fierce conviction. You're the one with the name on the door. You're Alexander Blackwood. If you don't stand for the things that are beautiful and permanent, then what was the point of building an empire in the first place? The silence that followed was heavy with the sound of the rain against the roof. The candle flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across their faces. Alexander finally reached out and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm, his grip firm. It was the first time they had touched, and it felt like a circuit closing. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a gesture of alignment. Show me, he whispered. Show me what you found. Rosie hesitated, then reached under the counter and pulled out her leather-bound portfolio, the one she had been filling with the silver pen. She spread the blueprints across the laminate counter, the candlelight illuminating the intricate lines and the bold, revolutionary designs for the glass atrium. For the next 3 hours, the world outside ceased to exist. In the dark of the diner, the waitress and the architect spoke as equals. She showed him the drainage solution. He showed her how to scale the structural supports. They argued over aesthetics and agreed on foundations. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the gray Atlantic in shades of bruised purple, Alexander looked at Rosie with an expression she had never seen before. It was more than love. It was awe. You're not a waitress who studies architecture, Rosie, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You are an architect who happens to be a waitress, and the world is about to find that out. He stood up to leave, but before he reached the door, he turned back. The town hall meeting is tomorrow night, Rosie. If you're going to fight me with everything you have. Don't hold back because of this. He gestured between them, to the shared space, the shared coffee, the shared secret. I won't, she promised, her heart breaking even as it soared. Good, he said, because I need you to be the one to save me from myself. He disappeared into the morning light, leaving Rosie alone in the diner. She looked down at her blueprints. The silver ink shimmered. She knew that by tomorrow night, the town would never look at her the same way again. And she knew that Alexander Blackwood had just handed her the sword he expected her to use against him. The rising blueprint had reached its peak. The construction of their love was complete. Now, they would have to see if it could withstand the wrecking ball. The town hall of Oak Haven smelled of wet wool, floor wax, and the desperate electric hum of a community on the brink of losing its heart. Rosie stood at the very back of the room, her back pressed against the cold mahogany wainscoting. She hadn't had time to change. She was still in her salty anchor uniform, the faded blue dress, the white apron now stained with a Rorschach test of gravy and coffee. She felt the eyes of the townspeople sliding over her, some with pity, others with the dismissive indifference one reserved for furniture. She clutched her leather portfolio to her chest. Inside, the pages were heavy with the ink of the silver pen. Order! Order in the room! Mayor Higgins hammered his gavel, the sound flat and hollow in the cavernous chamber. We are here to hear the final proposal from the Blackwood Group regarding the St. Jude's Library site. The double doors at the front of the hall swung open. The air in the room seemed to vacate. A phalanx of men in charcoal gray suits marched down the center aisle, their footsteps a synchronized rhythmic thud that sounded like the ticking of a clock. In the center of them, tall, untouchable, and radiating a cold magnetic power, was Alexander. He wasn't the man from Table 4 anymore. He wasn't the silent architect who left rare journals on diner seats. He was the apex predator of the real estate world. His suit was tailored with a precision that made the rest of the room look like it was melting. His hair, usually ruffled by the sea breeze, was swept back into a severe professional style. Rosie felt a sharp, physical pain in her sternum. The Blackwood in Blackwood group wasn't a coincidence. It was a crown. Alexander stepped onto the dais, the light from the chandeliers catching the silver at his temples. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at the blueprints spread out before him by his assistants. Members of the council, citizens of Oakhaven, he began. His voice was different here. It didn't have the warmth of the diner. It was a blade of ice, polished and sharp. The data is conclusive. The St. Jude's structure is fundamentally compromised. To attempt a restoration is not only a fiscal impossibility, but a public safety hazard. The Blackwood Group proposes a full demolition to make way for the Oakhaven Meridian, a world-class resort that will bring 300 jobs to this coastline. A murmur of conflicted hope and mourning rippled through the room. 300 jobs was the sound of survival for a town like this. The structural reports, Alexander continued, his eyes finally scanning the room, indicate that the limestone foundation has reached its porosity limit. The western parapet is beyond salvage. That's a lie. The voice was small, but in the sudden silence of the hall, it rang out like a bell. Alexander stopped mid-sentence. His head turned slowly toward the back of the room. The crowd parted, a sea of flannel and raincoats opening to reveal a single girl in a waitress uniform. Rosie's heart was trying to kick its way out of her ribs, but her legs were steady. She began to walk down the aisle. Every step felt like she was shedding a layer of her old life. She didn't look at the mayor. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked only at Alexander. "The limestone isn't the problem, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word. She reached the front of the room and laid her portfolio onto the table where the billionaire's $1 million plan sat. "And you know it." "Rosie," Alexander whispered. It wasn't a greeting. It was a warning, a plea, and a recognition all at once. "The porosity of the limestone is a symptom, not the cause," Rosie said, turning to the council. She pulled out her sketches, the ones drawn with his pen. She pinned them to the corkboard behind the dais, covering the sleek, soulless renderings of the hotel. The original 1890 drainage system was diverted during the 1954 road expansion, Rosie explained, her fingers tracing the intricate lines of her own blueprints. "The water isn't coming from the sea. It's being trapped behind the western parapet, creating a lateral load imbalance. You don't need to tear the building down. You need to reinstall the hydrostatic relief valves and reinforce the arches with carbon fiber tension rods." A stunned silence descended. The head engineer for the Blackwood Group, a man with 30 years of experience, leaned forward, squinting at Rosie's drawings. "Where did you get these surveys, girl?" the engineer asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "These aren't public records." "I spent 3 years in the archives," Rosie said, her chin lifting. "While I was serving you coffee and cleaning up your crumbs, I was calculating the weight of every stone in that building. I have a degree in structural architecture from the State University, earned while working 60 hours a week at the Anchor. I know that building better than your censors ever will." She turned back to Alexander. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes locked on her. The betrayal she felt was a living thing between them, a jagged piece of glass. "You knew," she whispered, loud enough only for him to hear. "When you sat in my diner, when you gave me that pen, you knew I was the only one who could see the truth. And you wanted to see if I'd have the courage to stand up here and stop you." Alexander didn't deny it. He didn't look at his board. He stepped closer to the edge of the dais, looking down at the girl in the stained apron who had just dismantled his multi-million-dollar project with a single napkin's worth of genius. "The lateral load," Alexander said, his voice dropping to that low, private resonance. "You've accounted for the cliffside erosion?" "Page 14 of my report," she snapped. "I've designed a cantilevered foundation that uses the library's own weight to stabilize the cliff. It's not just a restoration, Alexander. It's a reinforcement." The room erupted. The mayor was hammering his gavel, the townspeople were shouting, and the Blackwood lawyers were scrambling. But in the center of the storm, there was a vacuum of silence where Rosie and Alexander stood. "You've cost me $50 million tonight, Rosie," Alexander said. There was no anger in his voice. There was something far more terrifying: pride. "I didn't cost you anything," she replied, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I saved you from becoming the man who destroys things because it's easier than fixing them. But don't expect me to thank you for the opportunity." She gathered her papers, her hands finally beginning to shake. She had done it. She had exposed him, and in doing so, she had exposed herself. She was no longer the invisible waitress. She was the woman who had challenged a giant. As she turned to leave, Alexander reached out, his hand catching her wrist for a fleeting second. "Rosie," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide from the room any longer. "The waltz isn't over. It's just the tempo that's changed." Rosie pulled her arm away, the heat of his touch lingering like a burn. She walked out of the town hall into the freezing coastal rain, leaving her portfolio behind on his table. She walked until her lungs burned, until the lights of the town hall were just a blur in the mist. She had won the battle for the library, but as she looked down at her empty hands, she realized she had lost the man who had finally made her feel seen. She was a genius without a job, a scholar without a patron, and a woman whose heart was now as fractured as the limestone she had fought to save. The heavy oak doors of the St. Jude's Library didn't groan when Rosie pushed them open the following Monday. They sighed, a long, rasping exhalation of dust and trapped Atlantic air. Inside, the rotunda was a skeletal forest of yellow steel. Scaffolding rose like invasive vines toward the fractured dome, obscuring the Gothic arches Rosie had memorized from the shadows of the basement. The silence was gone, replaced by the rhythmic, aggressive thwack-thwack-thwack of a pneumatic hammer echoing from the western wing, and the low hum of industrial heaters that did little to fight the bone-deep chill of the stone. Rosie stood in the center of the marble floor, her boots scuffing against a layer of fine gray silt. She wasn't wearing her blue waitress dress. She wore rugged denim, heavy work boots, and a canvas jacket that smelled of the cedar chest it had been stored in for years. In her hand, she gripped the leather portfolio, its edges softened by her nervous palms. "She's here," a voice called out, sharp and skeptical. Rosie looked up. On a temporary plywood platform near the rotunda's base stood 3 men. They were the Suits, architects from the Blackwood Group's New York office, their high-visibility vests looking pristine and artificial over their Italian wool coats. In the center of them stood Alexander. He didn't have a vest on. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with tension, and his face was smudged with the very same limestone dust that coated the floor. When his eyes met Rosie's, the air between them didn't crackle with the fire of the town hall. It settled into a heavy, grounding weight. "Gentlemen," Alexander said, his voice cutting through the noise of the machinery. "This is Rosie. She is the lead project architect. Her word on the structural reinforcement is final." One of the men, a silver-haired executive named Sterling, let out a short, jagged laugh. "Alexander, be serious. The board is already breathing down our necks about the $50 million pivot. You're putting the integrity of the firm in the hands of a girl who—" He paused, his eyes raking over Rosie's practical clothes. "Who was pouring my decaf 6 days ago." Rosie felt the familiar sting of the grease-stained stigma, the heat rising to her throat. She stepped forward, her boots echoing with a new authoritative cadence. She didn't look at Sterling. She walked straight to the base of the western parapet, where a massive crack ran like a lightning bolt through the masonry. "The lateral load imbalance isn't a theory, Mr. Sterling," Rosie said, her voice flat and cold. "If you look at the mortar displacement at the 4-meter mark, you'll see the salt efflorescence indicates an internal hydrostatic pressure of nearly 40 pounds per square inch. Your team's plan was to drill into the foundation. If you had done that, the sheer force of the trapped water would have caused a catastrophic cleavage of the entire western wall within 48 hours. She turned, her eyes hard. "I'm not here because Alexander is a philanthropist. I'm here because I'm the only person in this room who knows how to keep 10 tons of Gothic stone from crushing you into the dirt. Now, either get me the carbon fiber tension rod specifications or get out of my building." Sterling's mouth thinned into a line, but he didn't speak. He looked at Alexander, who was watching Rosie with an expression of quiet, dangerous pride. With a curt nod, the executives retreated toward the makeshift office in the archives, their expensive shoes clicking a hasty retreat. The silence that followed was intimate, filled only with the distant drip of water and the hum of the heaters. Alexander stepped off the platform and walked toward her. He was holding a paper cup. As he reached her, he held it out. It was a cup from the Salty Anchor. "I went by this morning," he said softly. "Elias says the coffee tastes like battery acid since you left." Rosie took the cup, the warmth of the cardboard seeping into her cold fingers. The smell of the burnt roast brought a sudden, sharp wave of melancholy. "I didn't think you'd ever go back there." "I go where the inspiration is," he replied. They stood together in the shadows of the crumbling library, a waitress and a billionaire, now just two builders standing in the ruins. "The board is moving against me, Rosie," he said, his voice dropping. "They've filed an injunction to halt the restoration. They claim your designs are unproven. We have 7 days to stabilize the dome. If the primary arch isn't secured by Sunday, they'll pull the funding, and the demolition crew returns on Monday morning." Rosie felt the clock begin to tick in her blood. 7 days? To reroute the drainage and install the tension rods? Alexander, that's a 3-week job for a full crew. "Then we don't sleep," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver pen. He held it out to her, handle first. "I think you're going to need this." The next 4 days were a descent into a world of stone, iron, and salt. They lived inside the library. Rosie set up a cot in the rare books room, surrounded by the smell of decaying vellum. Alexander took the office across the hall. They worked in cycles of 4 hours. 4 hours on the scaffolding, 2 hours of sleep, then back to the blueprints. The technical intimacy grew with every hour. There was no room for the polite distance of the diner. When Rosie was 10 meters up on a swaying platform, her life depended on Alexander's grip on the safety line. When they discussed the placement of the carbon fiber rods, their heads would bow together over a single light table, their shoulders touching, their breaths mingling in the freezing air. She saw the man behind the empire. She saw the way he obsessed over the smallest detail, not out of a desire for profit, but out of a deep, haunting fear of being inadequate to the legacy of his ancestors. And he saw her. The way her mind moved like a laser, slicing through complex equations. The way she treated every stone like a patient she was trying to keep alive. "Hold the torch higher," Rosie whispered on the third night. They were deep in the crawl space beneath the rotunda, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. Alexander held the light steady. "The fissure is deeper than the survey showed." "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Rosie murmured, her fingers tracing the jagged edge of the 1890 stone. "Even in its breaking, it shows you how it was built to last. It's just tired, Alexander. It's been holding up the sky for 100 years with no help." "We all get tired of holding up the sky," Alexander said. Rosie looked at him. In the flickering light of the torch, his eyes were dark and searching. He reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of grit from her cheek. His hand lingered there, the calluses of his own hard work catching against her skin. The romantic tension was a living thing, a bridge of heat in a cold, dying building. They were closer than they had ever been at the diner, stripped of their titles, their history, and their pride. "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. "You could have hired any firm in the world to fight your board." "Because they would have seen a project," he said, his face inches from hers. "You saw a soul. And I realized that if I let them tear this down, I was letting them tear down the only part of myself that still felt real." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. For a moment, the library felt safe. The shadows were no longer predatory, they were protective. But the moment was shattered by a sharp metallic crack echoing from the rotunda above. Rosie bolted upright, nearly striking her head on the low ceiling. The primary arch. They scrambled out of the crawl space, their boots thundering on the marble. They reached the center of the rotunda just as a cloud of white dust billowed down from the ceiling. High above, one of the temporary support beams had buckled. It wasn't a natural failure. The steel had been notched, a clean, intentional cut that had weakened under the pressure. "Sabotage," Alexander hissed, his jaw tightening. "Sterling." Rosie didn't look at the beam. She looked at the floor. The dust was settling, but the sound, a low, rhythmic groaning, was growing louder. "Alexander, look." She pointed to the western wall. The drainage system they had just begun to reroute was backing up. Water was gushing from a ruptured pipe, flooding the foundation at 10 times the natural rate. Someone hadn't just weakened the beam. They had turned the library's greatest weakness into a weapon. "The lateral load," Rosie whispered, her face going pale. "If that water reaches the main arch before the tension rods are set, the whole western wing is going into the sea tonight." The descent had reached its lowest point. The truss they had built was the only thing holding the ceiling up, and the floor was literally disappearing beneath their feet. The sound was no longer a groan. It was a shriek of dying metal. "The carbon rods won't hold." Alexander's voice was barely audible over the roar of the water gushing from the ruptured main. The rotunda had become a drum, amplifying the chaos of the flood. Mud-colored water surged over their boots, swirling with the white dust of ancient limestone. Rosie stood frozen for a split second, her eyes darting from the buckled steel beam above to the torrent of water drowning the foundation. The technical reality hit her like a physical blow. The lateral load had exceeded her calculations because of the sabotage. The building wasn't just tired, it was being murdered. "The overflow channel," she screamed, pointing toward the dark recesses of the western wing. "Alexander, the 1890 blueprints showed a secondary relief channel behind the archive wall. It was sealed in the 50s, but the pressure. If we can crack the seal, the water will divert into the old cistern instead of the foundation." Alexander didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy sledgehammer from the scaffolding. "Where?" "Section 4, behind the Blackwood family records." They ran through the rising water, the cold soaking into their jeans, making every step a labor. They reached the back of the archives, where rows of empty metal shelves stood like skeletons. Rosie threw herself against the shelving unit, her small frame straining against the bolted steel. Alexander stepped beside her, his shoulder slamming into the metal with a grunt of exertion. Together they heaved until the unit toppled, crashing into the floodwater with a massive spray. Rosie clawed at the damp, moldering wallpaper, tearing it away to reveal the brickwork beneath. There, the original archway. It's been bricked over, but the structural seam is weak. Alexander swung the sledgehammer. The impact vibration traveled through the floor, a bone-shaking thud. He swung again, and again. His breath came in ragged gasps, his shirt clinging to his back, soaked with sweat and rain. "It's not moving," he yelled, the hammer rebounding off the solid masonry. Rosie looked at the wall, her mind racing through the chemical composition of the 1950s mortar. Not the center, the keystone. Hit the junction where the new brick meets the 1890 limestone. The expansion rates are different. There's a stress fracture there. Alexander adjusted his stance. He swung with everything he had, a primal roar escaping his throat. The hammer struck the junction. A single hairline crack appeared. He struck again. With a sound like a gunshot, the wall gave way. A wall of trapped water exploded outward, knocking them both backward into the sludge. But the roar changed pitch. The gushing torrent that had been threatening the foundation was suddenly sucked into the dark maw of the old cistern. The suction was violent, a whirlpool forming in the center of the room as the pressure began to equalize. High above, the shrieking of the metal rods softened to a low, vibrant hum. The tension was holding. Rosie lay in the mud, gasping for air, her chestnut hair plastered to her face. She felt a hand wrap around hers. Alexander pulled her up, his grip shaking but unbreakable. They stood in the dim, receding water, surrounded by the wreckage of his family's history and her life's work. "We saved it," he whispered, his forehead leaning against hers. "You saved it," she corrected, her voice trembling. "No," he said, pulling back to look at her with an intensity that burned through the shadows. "I just swung a hammer. You're the one who knew where the heart was." The heavy doors of the library burst open. The morning sun spilled into the rotunda, cutting through the dust and mist in long, heavenly shafts of gold. Framed in the doorway stood the mayor, a huddle of townspeople, and the board of directors, led by a pale, sweating Sterling. They had come to witness a collapse. Instead, they found a cathedral. Rosie stepped forward, her hand still locked in Alexander's. She didn't look like a waitress. She didn't look like a girl in over her head. She looked like the mistress of the stone. Mr. Sterling. Alexander's voice returned to its cold CEO authority, though he didn't let go of Rosie's hand. I believe you'll find the structural integrity of this wing is now superior to any hotel you could have built, and I believe the police will find the notched steel in the western arch quite interesting when they conduct their forensic sweep. Sterling turned to flee, but the local sheriff, who had been among the worried townspeople, was already stepping forward. The townspeople didn't cheer immediately. They stood in a stunned, reverent silence looking up at the dome. The light was hitting the glass atrium Rosie had designed. The temporary plastic sheeting had been blown away in the storm, revealing the intricate lattice of the new reinforcement. It was beautiful. It was a bridge between the past and a future they hadn't dared to imagine. 6 months later, the salt air was crisp, carrying the scent of expensive perfume and aged scotch. The St. Jude's Library sat on the cliffside like a beacon, its stone scrubbed clean, its glass dome shimmering under a violet twilight. The grand gala was a sea of tuxedos and silk gowns. The who's who of the architectural world had flown in from London, Tokyo, and New York. They wandered the stacks, marveling at the way the light moved through the space, whispering about the visionary of Oakhaven. Rosie stood at the top of the marble staircase. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented the fire in her eyes, her hair styled in elegant waves that reached her shoulders. But if one looked closely at her hands, the faint, permanent calluses of a builder were still there. Alexander stood beside her, his hand resting possessively, proudly on the small of her back. Ladies and gentlemen, Alexander's voice filled the rotunda, amplified by the perfect acoustics Rosie had calculated. 3 years ago, I came to this town to tear something down. I thought I knew what value was. I thought I knew what legacy meant. I was wrong. He looked at Rosie, and for a moment the hundreds of guests vanished. I was saved by a woman who saw the world not for what it was, but for what it could be. She didn't have a firm, she didn't have a budget, and she didn't have an audience. She had a pen and a dream she refused to let die while she served coffee to a man too blind to see her. Tonight, we don't just celebrate a building. We celebrate the lead architect of the Blackwood anchor firm. My partner, my equal. The applause was a thunderous wave, but Rosie barely heard it. She looked out at the crowd and saw the regulars from the Salty Anchor, Elias in a borrowed suit, Mr. Henderson looking uncomfortable but proud. They weren't looking at a waitress. They were looking at the woman who had given their town its pride back. After the speeches, the crowd migrated toward the gardens. Rosie retreated to the private office at the top of the west wing, the room that overlooked the sea. On the center of the mahogany desk sat a small silver tray. Rosie approached it, her heart fluttering. There, resting on the velvet, was a single heavy brass key. It wasn't a key to the library, and it wasn't a key to the hotel. It was a key she didn't recognize. Next to it was a folded napkin, the cheap, rough paper from the Salty Anchor. On it, in Alexander's elegant script, were the words, Table 4, for the girl who memorized my order. I've memorized your dreams. Alexander stepped into the room, closing the door behind him, shutting out the noise of the gala. What is this? She whispered, picking up the key. It's the deed to the Point House, he said, walking toward her. The estate on the North Cliff. I bought it the day after the town hall. I've spent the last 6 months having it gutted. I didn't want to design it, Rosie. I wanted it to be a blank canvas. He took her hand, the key pressing between their palms. It has a 3-story studio facing the ocean. It has a library that will hold 10,000 volumes. And it has a kitchen where no one will ever ask you for a refill. He dropped to one knee, the silhouette of his strength framed against the moonlit Atlantic. He didn't pull out a ring yet. He just held her hand, looking up at her with a vulnerability that made her breath catch. Rosie, I've spent my life building walls. I want to spend the rest of it building a home, with you. As my wife, as my partner, as my life's greatest work. Will you build a future with me? Rosie looked down at the key, then at the man who had seen her in the dark. She thought of the 3 years of silence, the weight of the trays, and the silver pen that had rewritten her soul. Only if we design the nursery together, she whispered, tears finally spilling over. And Alexander? Yes? I'm still keeping the silver pen. He laughed, a sound of pure earned joy, and stood to pull her into a kiss that tasted of salt, dreams, and the permanence of stone. The waitress of Oakhaven was gone. In her place stood a woman who had built her own bridge to the stars. 5 years later, the Atlantic wind still carried the same sharp scent of salt and ancient depths, but the sounds it traveled through had changed. The morning shriek of the gale had been replaced by the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a town that had finally found its footing. Rosie stood on the balcony of the Point House, her fingers curled around the iron railing she had designed herself. The metal was cool, but the sun, hanging low and heavy like a ripened peach over the horizon, warmed her skin. She wasn't wearing an apron. She wore a tailored suit of charcoal silk, the sleeves pushed back to reveal wrists that no longer trembled from the weight of heavy ceramic trays. Behind her, the floor-to-ceiling glass doors of her studio slid open. The sound was a whisper of precision engineering. "The light is hitting the dome," Alexander said. He didn't need to walk to the railing to know. He moved across the room with the quiet, grounded grace that had first captivated her at table 4. He stopped behind her, his chest a solid warmth against her back, his arms encircling her waist. His hands, once the hands of a distant mogul, were now the hands that helped her bathe their daughter and steady her pulse before a major keynote. "Look at it, Rosie," he murmured into the curve of her neck. "It's glowing." A mile down the coast, perched on the jagged cliffside, the St. Jude's Library caught the final rays of the day. The glass atrium, Rosie's dome of light, acted like a prism, scattering fractured beams of gold and violet across the town of Oakhaven. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a lighthouse of the mind. "I still can't believe we didn't use the reinforced concrete for the North Arch," Rosie said, her voice teasing, a soft echo of the intellectual debates that had become the soundtrack of their marriage. Alexander laughed, a low, vibrant sound that vibrated through her. "And I still can't believe you were right about the limestone's compression limit. Every time I look at that arch, I see your stubbornness turned into stone." "It's not stubbornness, Alex. It's integrity. There's a difference." "To you, they've always been the same thing," he said, turning her in his arms. The power imbalance that had once defined them, the billionaire and the waitress, the hunter and the hidden, had long since evaporated, leaving behind a partnership of absolute equals. They were the founders of Blackwood and Anchor, a firm that had become synonymous not with demolition but with the radical act of preservation. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, familiar object, the silver pen. It was scratched now, the engraving form follows function slightly worn from years of use in the field, but it remained her most prized possession. "You left this on the drafting table," he said, tucking it into the pocket of her blazer. "You're going to need it tomorrow. The university wants the first sketches for the new scholarship wing." Rosie took the pen, her thumb tracing the familiar cool metal. "I want to name it after the salty anchor." Alexander smiled. "I thought you might." An hour later, they drove down the winding coastal road, the town lights beginning to twinkle like fallen stars in the valley. They didn't stop at the library, though it was bustling with evening students. Instead, they pulled the SUV into the gravel lot of the diner. The salty anchor looked exactly as it had for 40 years. The neon sign still flickered on the S, and the smell of griddle grease and sea air greeted them as they stepped through the door. But there was a new plaque by the entrance, subtle and brass, owned and protected by the Anchor Foundation. The bell chimed as they entered. "Table 4, Rosie whispered, a mischievous glint in her hazel eyes. "Always," Alexander replied. They slid into the corner booth. The laminate was the same, the view of the library through the window was the same, but the woman who approached them was new. She was young, perhaps 19, with a face that looked tired but a gaze that was sharp. In the crook of her arm, tucked beneath a stack of menus, was a thick textbook on urban planning. Rosie felt a sudden, sharp pang of recognition. She looked at the girl. Her name tag read Isla, and then at the textbook. "Rough shift?" Rosie asked, her voice filled with a warmth that made the girl pause. Isla sighed, brushing a stray hair from her forehead. "The dinner rush never ends, does it? People get hungry for burgers, but they don't care about the girl serving them." "Some people do," Rosie said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver pen. She laid it on the table, not as a tip, but as a bridge. "And some people are just waiting for you to show them what you're studying when you think no one is looking." Isla's eyes widened as she looked from the pen to the famous architect she had seen on the news, and then to the man beside her who was watching his wife with a look of pure, unadulterated devotion. I've read your book, Ms. Anchor," the girl stammered. "The one about the library. I want to build things that last, too." "Then start by finishing that chapter," Rosie said, sliding a business card across the table. "And when you're ready to trade that apron for a drafting stool, call the number on the back. We're looking for someone who knows how to hold up a heavy tray. They're usually the ones who know how to hold up a ceiling." The girl's face transformed, a look of sudden blinding hope lighting up her features. She nodded, clutching the card to her chest as if it were a holy relic, before scurrying back to the kitchen. Alexander reached across the table, his hand finding Rosie's. His fingers interlaced with hers, the calluses of their shared work meeting in a perfect, familiar lock. "You're going to populate the whole firm with waitresses, aren't you?" he asked, his voice thick with affection.
"Only the brilliant ones," she replied. They sat in silence for a long moment watching the moon rise over the library dome.
The unresolved tension of their past, the fear of being unseen, the burden of a cold legacy, the scars of a town that had almost given up, had all been built over, reinforced by 5 years of shared laughter, midnight arguments, and the quiet security of a love that had been earned in the mud and the dark. "Are you happy, Rosie?" Alexander asked. It was a question he asked often, not out of insecurity, but as a way of checking the foundation of their life. Rosie looked out at the skyline. She saw the library she had saved, the firm she had built, and the man who had become her home. She thought of the girl she used to be, hiding charcoal-stained fingers in the folds of a blue dress, and the woman she was now, whose signature was etched into the very horizon of the city. "I'm more than happy, Alex," she said, leaning forward to press her forehead against his. "I'm permanent." As they left the diner, the cool night air enveloped them. They walked toward the car, but Rosie stopped for a moment, looking back at the salty Anchor. Through the window, she could see Isla sitting at the counter in the empty diner, the silver pen in her hand, her head bowed over her textbook. Rosie smiled, a quiet, private victory. The cycle of invisibility had been broken. They drove back toward the Point House, where their daughter was waiting with the nanny, where blueprints for a new sustainable city sat on the desks, and where a shared life of purpose and passion awaited them. The story of the waitress and the architect didn't end with a wedding or a gala. It ended in the stillness of a shared drive home, in the confidence of a hand held in the dark, and in the knowledge that no matter how many buildings they built, the most important structure they would ever design was the love that now lived between them, a dome of light that no storm could ever dim. The skyline was dark now, save for the stars and the library's glow, but the path forward was perfectly clear. They were builders. They were partners. They were home. If this story touched you, leave a comment. I read every single one. Thank you for watching, and until the next story.